at New York University. And can you tell me a little bit how you got involved with supporting WikiLeaks?
Oh, well, I've been a supporter of WikiLeaks from the beginning because, I believe deeply in their function, which is to provide the people of the world with information they need to know. I mean, I see it as a journalistic outlet, and that's therefore due all the protections that journalistic outlets are due. You said a moment ago that I was going to talk about this case from a legal point of view, but that's not my specialty. I'm actually a professor of, it's okay, of media studies, and kind of an advocate for democratic reforms of all kinds. And I think we should address this case from that standpoint. I watched the last 15 or so minutes of Kim.com's interview with you, which I thought was really interesting. And I agree that a letter writing campaign to the Nobel Committee is a very good idea. But I think that Kim kind of understated the difficulty of the task that lies before us. He's more confident than I am in the American voting system, for one thing. I actually don't believe that Donald Trump really won the election legitimately. And this is based on forensic study of the returns in the swing states and other factors. I don't believe that he was actually elected president any more than Hillary Clinton actually won her party's nomination. That was stolen from Bernie Sanders. I think that the voting system in this country is profoundly corrupt. And it's not just a personal opinion. That's actually a judgment shared by researchers at Harvard and the University of Sydney, who have ranked the US voting system the worst in the developed world, okay? 26th out of 26. Donald Trump wasn't actually elected. Hillary Clinton didn't actually win her party's nomination, which is to say that the will of the electorate isn't really honored in this country and hasn't been for quite some time. So my pessimism about the voting system is continuous with my pessimism about the media system in the United States and throughout the West. And I think, yeah, go ahead.
Why do you think WikiLeaks isn't getting more support from the mainstream media?
Well, that's, obviously the question. You'd think that they would get support from the mainstream media. I prefer to call them the corporate media, by the way, because in a sense, they're not mainstream at all. I mean, their view of reality is so eccentric that, calling it mainstream is giving them too much credit, if you see what I mean. The corporate media should be honoring and championing Julian Assange and standing up for him. If for no other reason than that they have benefited so enormously from his revelations, right? So you'd think they'd spring to his defense. Despite the benefits that they've enjoyed thanks to his revelations, they have basically piled on him. They have attacked him and or totally ignored his plight. Let me give you an example. Before we met today, I did a little quick research on the way that the New York Times has been covering his predicament at the moment. And strikingly, although it's not a surprise, readers of the New York Times are really not going to have any idea that Julian is in the trouble that he's in and suffering the way he's suffering. The last time the Times mentioned anything about him was in a piece on June 29th, at the very, very end of an article about Mike Pence's upcoming trip to South America, either an upcoming trip or a trip he was actually going on. I can't remember which. But at the very end of the article, amid some paragraphs about Ecuador, there was a very quick closing reference to his desire to press Lenin Moreno, the president of Ecuador, about terminating Assange's asylum. A couple of days before that, the Times ran an article about Senate Democrats pressing Pence to get Ecuador to terminate Assange's asylum. This is Democratic senators. I think there are 10 of them. Democratic senators calling on Mike Pence, part of the hated Trump-Pence team, to press the president of Ecuador to make Assange available to the clutches of the United States. That was an article in the Times. What I'm saying is that the fact that he's incommunicado, the fact that he's been denied medical attention, these facts are unknown to the average reader of the New York Times, which is to say that they're also unknown to the people who listen to NPR, watch MSNBC, watch CNN, read the Washington Post, read Time Magazine. You can go through the whole gamut of our liberal media and find the same silence, the same blackout of all this crucial information about Julian Assange. And now, finally, to answer your question, Cass, as to why it is that the press, the corporate press, is not championing Assange, it's because the corporate press in the United States is state-controlled, okay? State-controlled. We have a state-controlled media system. Now, that sounds provocative because if you read the New York Times and all those other outlets and listen to NPR and so on, the adjective state-controlled is always applied to the press in places like China and Iran and Cuba. We say, oh, the state-controlled media in these countries. The presumption there is that our media is not state-controlled. Well, in fact, our media is state-controlled, okay? The control is tacit. It is indirect, okay? It's not formal the way it is in China. So that kind of inexplicitness allows all too many Americans, including maybe even especially highly educated Americans, to presume that we have a free press. We have a feisty, scrappy, independent press. After all, they're part of the resistance against Donald Trump, so they must be a free press, right? The fact is that our press is an adjunct of the intelligence agencies, okay? When the New York Times reports on something involving the FBI or the CIA or the NSA, they invariably quote them stenographically. That is to say, they simply write down what they had to say. They never challenge them. They never question them. Now, you would think that since suddenly and shockingly, I suppose it's shocking, the Trump administration has its sights set on Julian Assange. Jeff Sessions has made this abundantly clear. They regard him as kind of an enemy combatant. You would think that the so-called resistance would spring to the defense of Julian Assange, because generally speaking, anything that Trump is for, the other side is against, and anything that Trump's against, the other side is for, right? So if he seems to be for some kind of peace on the Korean Peninsula, the so-called resistance is against it, right? If Trump is in favor of dialing down tensions with Russia, the so-called democratic resistance is against that. They want a more warlike relationship with Russia. So for consistency's sake, you would think that they'd say, well, Trump doesn't want Assange to be free. He wants to bust Assange, kidnap him, throw him into the dungeon. You'd think they'd say, well, no, we think Assange is doing a good thing. Of course not. They hate Julian Assange. They hate him because, Kim.com brought this up, they hate him because they think that he was instrumental in Trump's victory. The so-called resistance believes in the fantasy known as Russiagate. They believe this, and they think that Julian Assange was part of that. They think that he's a tool of the Kremlin. And because they think that, because they are incapable of understanding how elections are actually stolen in the United States, they're stolen by usually Republican operatives. Since they insist on blaming Russia for what happened to Hillary Clinton, although, as I said earlier, she didn't actually lose. They have to blame Russia. They have to see Julian Assange as part of that. So in their eyes, what he did in turning on their their queen of virtue and democracy. They think that's unforgivable. They're actually pressing the Trump administration to take an even harder line on Assange, you know? So he has no support within the establishment. And I'm afraid he has nowhere near as much support as he should have among the population at large. He certainly has nowhere near as much support as he should have on the left, okay? And this gives us a sense of just how tight and comprehensive the state control of our media is, that even our left press, with a very few honorable exceptions, is appallingly silent on what's happening to Julian Assange. They are not speaking up in his defense. A few are, but most aren't. This is not the kind of burning issue that it should be, right? And I want to say something that may strike some people as provocative, but I actually think it's striking that Chelsea Manning had so much support, and rightly. I was a big supporter of Chelsea Manning's. I was part of the vast chorus of people demanding that she be free, right? While there was all this support for Chelsea Manning, there is weirdly very little support for Julian Assange. And I think I have to think it has to do with identity politics, that a lot of the support for Chelsea Manning had to do with the fact that she's transgender. You know, I think that in many people's minds, that actually trumped the invaluable civic service she rendered when, as Bradley Manning, she released all that information to WikiLeaks. I mean, that was a great thing that she did. I think that her gender status is irrelevant. But given the kind of primacy of identity politics on what we now call the left, although it's not really left at all, Chelsea Manning was an instant heroine. You know, she was sympathetic. People wanted her free, and it had everything to do with that. Julian Assange is just this white guy. And worse than that, he's a white guy who was accused of sexual predation. Now, those charges were horseshit, as Celia Farber has demonstrated definitively on Truthdig, right? Your dog agrees with me. I'm delighted that I have support.
Her name is Wiki, so Wiki, he has a lot of opinions.
Well, I'm sure I share those opinions. Yeah, the charges were baloney. Nevertheless, that did not stop the likes of Katha Pollitt at The Nation and other leftists from, attacking him for what he did to those women, even though he didn't actually do anything. And that impression of Julian Assange as this white male who is guilty of sexual predation, I really believe has had a lot to do with the failure of the so-called left to support him as he ought to be supported. Now I can't hear you suddenly.
Sorry, I had muted myself because my dog was barking.
Maybe your dog has a question for me.
Well, she is just relentless today.
A lot to talk about.
Graham Elwood and I were talking about this a little bit earlier, the difference between how, like, for example, the Washington Post covered the Sarah Palin emails when WikiLeaks released those. It feels almost like the Democratic Party is trying to erase people's memories. They're like, well, WikiLeaks has only gone after Democrats, or, they're biased. But people are forgetting that, they also dumped Sarah Palin's emails during an election.
Well, let me respond to that. That's a really important point. I hear this endlessly. People say, well, Assange was obviously working for Trump, which is to say working for Putin, because he didn't release any emails about Trump, right? Okay, now, I mean, this is one of those sort of nitwit opinions that people don't bother to test by doing some research. And in this case, the research wouldn't be too onerous. It would just be watching Laura Poitras's documentary Risk, which is actually kind of an anti-Assange documentary. But in that documentary, there is a moment during the 2016 campaign when Julian is thinking out loud, ruefully regretting the fact that they didn't have anything on Trump to release because Trump doesn't have any profile within US government institutions. And most of the stuff, you know, that WikiLeaks gets comes from whistleblowers who've been affiliated with various federal institutions. Donald Trump is just a crook, you know, a longtime mob-connected real estate mogul in New York City. The idea that he's part of some kind of fight against the deep state is laughable. This guy his mentor was Roy Cohn, the notorious mob-connected lawyer who worked for Senator Joe McCarthy. Trump is a deeply corrupt person. I don't think he has a civic bone in his body. But the fact is that he has had no history in those government agencies where he would have left some kind of a footprint, where there would be a paper trail that some whistleblower could then pack up and send off to WikiLeaks. Julian commented on this privately during the 2016 campaign, and it is entirely credible as an explanation of why it is that we got all this damning stuff about Hillary, but we didn't get anything like that about Trump, okay? But I mean, Democrats, I mean, Kim was talking about the kind of tribal denseness of Trump supporters, and he's absolutely right about that. The problem is that kind of obtuseness, that kind of thick-headedness is not unique to Trump supporters. It's just as common among Hillary supporters. They're just as tribal as people who support Trump, and a lot of Bernie people are just as tribal as the other two, okay? This is a problem with partisan perception across the board. So even if and when, like when I tell people, you know, people who are foaming at the mouth about Julian Assange and how he abetted Trump, I tell them to go watch Laura Poitras's Risk. I explain what Assange himself has had to say about the fact that he did not release anything about Trump. They don't hear it. They can't take it in because it contradicts something that they prefer to think, you know? But right. The fact is, yes, the entire so-called resistance, the entire Democratic Party connected establishment, which is another way to say the CIA, okay, is they have it in for Assange, just as the rest of the establishment has it in for Assange, just as the military has it in for Assange. We're living at a moment of vast suppression of inconvenient information, okay? It's affecting Julian especially egregiously. I mean, it amounts to kind of a crime against humanity, what they're doing to him, but it is not unique to him. It is the same treatment is being extended to all the rest of us, although less painfully, okay? I mean, I myself just today have had problems with Google. I've been shadow banned by Facebook, and I'm sure I'm not the only one of the panelists this weekend who is having this experience. The reason why Julian Assange is incommunicado, the reason why they're trying to shut him down, take him into custody, finish him off, terminate WikiLeaks, it is continuous with this desperate measure by the state to control the past in order to control the present and control the future, okay? I'm paraphrasing George Orwell's 1984. They don't want any contradiction of the official narratives. They don't want the propaganda narratives to be contradicted in any way. That includes Russiagate, that includes the atrocity campaign against Syria, that includes the stuff about Venezuela we're all reading, it includes the stuff about Nicaragua, okay? Across the board, it includes a lot of the stuff about Trump too, as a matter of fact. They don't want anyone to contradict it. So what's happening to Julian is continuous with all of that.
What would you suggest that people do? I mean, Kim had a great idea writing to the Nobel Committee. Other people have suggested protests and internet. What would you suggest that supporters of WikiLeaks who really want to help and who just don't know what to do, what would you suggest that they try and do?
Well, that's a tough one. I heartily second Kim's suggestion that we all write to the Nobel Committee, because it is possible that they can be shamed into doing the right thing here possible. It's a long shot, okay? It would be terrific to enlist the support of some high-profile individuals in that effort, possibly some Norwegian politicians, maybe some righteous celebrities. That always helps. It can't hurt. I mean, this is a crazy thought, but I remember that in, I forget which movie it was. I think it was maybe Risk. Lady Gaga went and visited Julian in the embassy in Ecuador. I mean, I wonder if she would be willing to help out with some kind of a public push for like clemency or for dropping the case against him. That's an idea. I think that pressure on the media could conceivably be helpful, but I think that mere verbal protests, mere online protests are probably not going to do anything, because it's very, very easy to tune that kind of thing out. I'm actually a believer in some kind of direct action. And I actually also think, in connection with that if and when the day comes when they try to take Julian out of the embassy and hustle him off into custody in preparation for extraordinary rendition to the United States, I think that his supporters in London should mob that site. I think people should show up in person, physically, to prevent his removal. Okay, I think enough people should do that so that the press has no choice but to cover it. I think that's where we are right now. I think we've gotten to the point where we have to stop simply venting on Facebook and signing online petitions and sort of put our money where our mouths are. Now, you flatteringly introduced me as someone expert on the legal dimensions of this case, and
sorry, I had misread something.
No, that's okay. I mean, I don't know anything about that, but I think that the legal fight also has to continue. I say this as a complete ignoramus on the technicalities of that fight, but we can't let that go. I think that Julian's plight as a political prisoner, let's call him a political detainee. His plight as a political detainee who is being denied the minimum. He is not being allowed to communicate with the outside world. He is not being allowed to communicate with his own family. He is not being given basic medical care. I mean, these are violations of Julian Assange's human rights. And I think that there conceivably could be some kind of effort in the UN, although I'm very pessimistic about that body as well. I think that wherever we can make the case that this is a political prisoner who is being abused, that this is a journalist who is being abused, we should definitely make that case, and we should make it as strenuously as we possibly can. I mean, somebody like Danny Sheehan, the great human rights lawyer. I don't know where he stands on this. I haven't talked to him about this, but somebody like that, who not only has a firm grasp of the pertinent law, but who also understands the need for a kind of public aspect of the legal fight. Somebody like that would be helpful, even if only for some advice, But I think that Julian's plight is inexcusable. I think Reporters Without Borders, these international entities that are dedicated to the protection of journalists, he should be their number one case, it seems to me. And wherever possible, the New York Times and CBS, etc., should be shamed for their silence on what they're doing to him, because he is indeed a journalist. Now, the problem is that it is precisely the press's corruption. It is precisely Julian's having exposed the tight connections between the liberal media and the Hillary Clinton campaign. That's what got him into trouble. I don't want to say in the first place, but that has added tremendously to his difficulties. That makes it unlikely that the press will come to his defense unless they're forced to do so. So I think that insofar as we're capable of having public voices in these days of shadow banning, we should use those voices to press the media to put its money where its mouth is and honor the freedom of the press. I mean, they're always very quick to scream about journalists who've allegedly been silenced in Putin's Russia. You know, they'll always count up the number of journalists who've been injured or intimidated in so-called closed societies. In Hong Kong, you know, they'll complain about the Chinese state. They have to be forced to recognize the fact that they too are complicit in something exactly like that, in remaining silent on the plight of Julian Assange, it seems to me.
Right, and it's really noticeable how silent all these human rights organizations and media organizations have been, because if this was any other journalist or publisher, there would be so much international outcry about the conditions that he's in right now that you wouldn't be able to ignore it.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. But they have a double standard, you know. I mean, they're not, there is nothing even remotely anti-war about the media in this country. I mean, on the contrary, it is an adjunct of the Pentagon, you know, right. And it functions as a cheering section for the military, right? So, you know, they're gonna go to bat for Julian Assange, you know, who released that gunship footage over Iraq. You know, he has gone directly against the wishes of the very agencies that pull the media's strings. Okay, again, the American press is state-controlled. That's a fact. The British press is too. So that's what we're up against, and that means it's going to take a particularly powerful effort to shame them into doing the right thing. And I'm not sure it's possible to do that. But I think the effort to get them to do that should at least rise to a certain level of visibility, to make it uncomfortable for them, but also to let other people know what's happening so that they will join the struggle, and the fight to pressure the press and the government will become that much more visible.
Right, I agree. So as we know right now, Julian has no access to the internet, phone, friends, visitors. But in case he's someday able to watch any of this, is there anything that you would like to say to Julian, or that you would want him to know while he's going through these difficult times?
Well, yeah, sure. I will say pretty much what I said last time. But before I do that, I do want to suggest, you asked what can people do? And I mean, I think the minimum that they can do is to write to him. They can write to Julian. All right? I'm sure you can give them the address of the embassy in Ecuador. He needs to hear from people. This is vital. He must be, he very well may be in despair because of his confinement, because of the dungeon-like conditions in which he's living and has been living for years. And he has no contact. It's like solitary, it's a kind of solitary confinement. So I think the first thing that any concerned person should do is to contact him. More generally, I would simply say, as others have said, and as I said last time, that he has to understand the necessity of remaining strong, and to bear in mind that what he's going through is itself proof that he's right, okay? It proves that he is right and has been right all along to do what he's been doing, okay? He would not be going through this torment now if he had not hit a nerve, if he had not hit the most important nerve, right? Which is the nerve that kind of dictates the reflexive protection of the propaganda narratives at all costs. He has done the invaluable work of exploding those narratives by offering contrary information, stuff that the state would prefer to have suppressed forever. He was right to do that. That's why he's suffering now. So his suffering is not pointless. It is not inexplicable. I'm sure it at times must feel unbearable to him, but it is sort of the proof of his rectitude. I mean, I hate to make him sound like some kind of a saint, because he's not dead yet. But the fact is that he has done a great thing. He is a heroic figure, and I would tell him to keep the faith on that basis.
Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and it was incredibly interesting to hear your perspective and your take on this.